According to reports, the Ukrainians destroy 90 Shaheed drones on the ground with an airstrike with drones, while the Russians themselves hit back against Ukrainian airports, causing more casualties. We'll talk about this as well as about the developments along the front lines, new news about the F-16s, and so much more in this situation report about the war in Ukraine. There have been additional Ukrainian attacks on the Crimean Peninsula. Explosions were reported from various military bases, and there are visual evidences like this here showing a warehouse being blown up. It was geolocated right in the southern part of the Crimean Peninsula, and according to reports, 90 Shaheed drones were stored in this building and destroyed on the ground. The Ukrainians also hit a logistics center for the Russian Black Sea Fleet with Storm Shadow. I have no idea what was supposed to be damaged there. The Russians on their side have attacked the airfield in Mirhorod. I made a video about that yesterday. The amount of Sukhoi 27 that were destroyed there isn't perfectly clear, and it's not perfectly clear how many of those were operational, but the context is more or less that probably operational planes were hit. There was also, just after that, another strike on an airfield, this time on Poltava. Here in Poltava is an airfield by the Ukrainian military as well. I think it is this one here. And there they struck a Mi-24 Hind, the combat helicopter, again with an Iskander with cluster munition, and checking the geolocation, checking the video and comparing it to Google Maps. I have not seen mothballed Mi-24 there in the past, so there's a decent possibility that this was an operational one, especially as there were also vehicles probably right in the process of resupplying, rearming, refueling the plane. The Russians also attacked Dnipro in an air attack, and there they likely hit Pifden Mash. This is the factory that made the engines for intercontinental ballistic missiles for the Soviet Union. This is the big Ukrainian missile factory, and it was struck now by the Russians. The Ukrainians have reported at least 5 people who have been killed in this attack, several more being injured. Let's switch to the front line here, and there was a geolocated Russian a strike on Russian positions here on the in the area of that was not where it meant to be. Here in the area of Sumy, and this was here. Ukrainians struck a position there, proving that Russians have to have been inside of Ukraine, but the Ukrainians were reporting only sabotage and reconnaissance troops entering, so this might be in this context. So far, I have not seen in any serious publications by either side the claim that for the town of Shurava was actually occupied. Shuravka was occupied and is currently under Russian control. So it seems to be the truth that the Russians crossed over, were identified, and then struck. The further east, the fighting continues. The Ukrainians are reporting fighting at Lyboke and at other places, and the focus, especially where we have changes, is inside of Vovchansk. Here the Russians were seen to resupply actually own troops with a drone, indicating that at least partially or for a time the soldiers there were cut off. The situation in the south is still somewhat unclear, but fresh geolocations have shown Russian troops in this area, whereas this area was at times showing Russian presence and Ukrainian presence. So the situation isn't fully clear here, but again, we do not see big capitulations or anything here. So even if Russians are more or less cut off there, we do not see them capitulate yet. On the Eastern Front, the Russians have advanced at Stelmachivka. For a distance of roughly 1.65 kilometers, they advanced along this tree line here, right to Stelmachivka on the Sherebets. They are now at the outskirts of the town that is not visible here on the map. Further south, they also advanced 1.55 kilometers in the direction of Makivka. Here again, they advanced along the tree lines and are now fighting in the outskirts, or they have reached the houses of Makivka and thus the Sherebets here. So the situation there, the Sherebets, is being reached by the Russians at more and more places. South of the Seversky Donetsk, the biggest change is definitely the canal district, which has now fallen completely into Russian hands. We have a fresh geolocation here in the southwest, where we see that the last houses in the southwest were covered, and the Ukrainians themselves now admit that they lost completely the control over the canal district. We've talked about it in the past that we saw airstrikes here, but they might have been somewhat older, which would have indicated Ukrainian control here. But the other indications, whenever we actually saw infantry, it was moving further towards the west, and a Ukrainian military spokesperson said that the Russians have been pushed out of the canal district, but there was no proof, while we had geolocations of them advancing at the same time. So as of now, the first quarter of Chasiv Yar has fallen to the Russians, and they have reached the canal along the whole length inside of the town itself. Further south, excuse me, further south, the Russians have advanced into Druzhba. Here we have a geolocation that is not on the map yet. We see them here in the first houses of Druzhba, and to the east, this is here, more or less. So they have advanced by another few hundred meters in this direction here, have advanced further after advancing in the direction of Pivnichne and Toresk in the past few days. The Russians keep advancing in this direction. Further south at Avdivka, the Russians made a minor break into the front line. It's not really a breakthrough because they weren't able to exploit it, but they managed to push through the front line along the tree line here and have now entered the town of Yurjevka, which is here. They have reached the outskirts of New York, an advance of roughly 3 kilometers in this direction, so a significant success for the Russians here in the north, and we see them advancing from the south towards Toresk and from the east as well over the past few days. In the west, the Russians managed to advance further along the railroad line here west of Ocheretine in the direction of Prores. Here, this area roughly fell to the Russians, so overall not a big change, but a change nonetheless. And the Russians have occupied the tree line north of Yevhenivka. This tree line here has now fallen to the Russians and is under their control. Not much of a surprise here, as they were in the south and in the north. The Ukrainians probably withdrew from those positions. Further south, we have geolocations that the Russians are advancing south of Sokil. Here is Sokil, and we now have them down here and in the south in a fresh geolocation where they have reached this point. The Ukrainians probably evacuated those tree lines here, and this allowed the Russians to advance further in this direction. The Russians also advanced along the Karlovske Reservoir, and here they have entered the northern houses of the town here. We have a geolocation of this as well, and this shows them here inside of the houses, having advanced somewhat into the town. Lately, we've seen them here and here, so they have advanced by another 500 meters more or less in this direction. They also advanced in the area east of Nevelske. There they managed to straighten the front line. This area here, more or less, I talked about it quite a time ago, that the Russians will likely occupy those tree lines, as I would expect the Ukrainians to withdraw from here, so not much of a surprise. Further south, the Russians advanced in Krasnohorivka as well. Here we have them now in this part visually identified. Now this is the first road and this is the second, easy to identify after the big buildings. So the first road, this the second, and they are roughly at this point here. By now they have advanced further north over the past few days. Further south in the area of Vuhledar, the Russians have occupied 3 more tree lines here. These 3 tree lines. So in the southeast, they managed to push somewhat forward, and in the close to the oblast area, where the oblast border, south of Velika Novosilka, where Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk meet. Now we have Staromayorsk visually identified, being occupied by the Russians. We had that in the past, that I showed you videos and geolocations where the Russians were operating in these streets, indicating that the Ukrainians can't have any control over the northern part anymore, because they seem to be on the middle of the road, which is not really the behavior you show when you expect to be shot at. And now we have them geolocated north of the town in 2 positions here. So we see that the Russians have now occupied this and reached this tree line and this tree line, confirming that Staromayorsk is now definitely fully under Russian control again. Overall, there is rumor that Colonel General Mikhail Teplinsky was victim of a HIMARS attack. He is wounded, according to reports, even from the Russian side as well, and with a strike on his headquarters where he met, and 5 other persons were dead. Teplinsky is generally not considered to be completely incompetent, so this should theoretically hurt the Russians to a certain degree. In troop generations, we have reports now that the Russians started using women in Storm Z and Storm V units. The Storm Z and Storm V units are the prison recruits that are being used more or less as cannon fodder in exchange for promise of pardon if they manage to survive. And now there are reports that increasingly women pop up in those units as well. So female prisoners obviously are being now recruited as well. We have another interesting news. This seems to be like the more everything changes, the more everything returns. Here we have the Russians basically introducing barrage balloons again. We have RIA Novosti reporting that the Russians, a company, has created a system to basically use airships that spread nets to cause drones. And just as an example, we see the example here that was used over D-Day, where those balloons were used. They were used to be obstacles for planes flying low level, as obviously the connection to the ground was through a steel cable that might be strong enough to cut off the wing of a plane hitting it. So they were meant to be obstacles in the against low-flying aircraft, and the Russians are returning to this technology in this context. The Russians have also shown a new anti-drone buggy, which is quite interesting system that we see here. It has 2 machine guns in the front and 6 AK-74 in the back turret, as we can see, with seats. So they are meant to be manned and shoot from there. And the interesting part we have here is that they even have the smoke launchers. For them, they apparently have shrapnel rounds that are meant to be used against drones as well. No idea how efficient this is going to be, but we see modifications and the attempts to innovate against modern threats in this context. Then we have news about Ukrainian troop generations. The Ukrainians have recruited the first 3,000 prisoners for the military. They have received their papers that will promise them a pardon if they do their job. And the Ukrainian police has said they are going to form 3 combat brigades out of police units. Now, obviously, policemen, while they might be schooled, while they might be trained in using infantry small arms, they usually aren't trained in anti-tank weapons, and they aren't trained in military combat. It's completely different to act as a policeman or as a soldier, as the demands and the behavior is completely different. So expecting them to be efficient really fast is probably too much, but I would guess, now this is my speculation, this is a nod towards the public, as in the past when the new mobilization law was discussed, I read it again and again that people in Ukraine said, don't we have more people who are ready to fight? Do we really need to draw in anyone else? Why can't the police, for instance, take the job? And this could be a sign by the Ukrainian police to show the public, hey, the policemen go to the front line as well, so you are not alone. We are not keeping the police back while they are somewhat trained and you have to go fight. And reports from Ukraine are that the F-16s supposedly are arriving this month and will show their debut in the combat in Ukraine. We'll have to see until it actually happens. We've heard it a couple of times in the past, but it might be the truth in this context this time. Then we have news that Tatania Shevtsova, who was the deputy defense minister in Russia, has switched sides and defected to France. Now, this is obviously highly interesting, as a deputy defense minister should have fairly good access to intelligence, to secret data, to details. She was responsible, from what I read, for procurement. The reason for that might be a lot more simple than it was to be expected. First, now, according to reports, she owns a lot of expensive property, among that in Moscow, which her wage was not sufficient to pay for. So she probably enriched herself in the defense ministry quite a lot and was afraid of being arrested for corruption like so many others. Now, so showing a sign that Putin's cleaning up of the military might have some unintended effects when it comes to defections. As said, like, the reports are not that she had a change of mind or something like this. It seems like she chose to rather defect than go to prison or fall out of a window in this context. And in international support, we have the French frontrunner, I guess, Bardella, who is from the Rassemblement National, the current leading party in the first round of the elections in France. He said if he wins, he's going to keep supporting Ukraine. I guess that's very good news for Ukraine in this regard. And the new Dutch premier has had a phone call with Zelensky, with the Ukrainian president already, where he affirmed that the Netherlands will continue supporting Ukraine. Also, there are going to be 40 billion euros in financial aid pledged for Ukraine for next year. That's 43 billion in US dollars. So more aid is going to come to Ukraine over the next year. More aid is being promised, and Ukraine will have some leeway to calculate in at least until 2025 or into 2025. And the US are currently preparing a new aid package with 2.3 billion dollars, which will include air defense, anti-tank weapons, and artillery ammunition, among other weaponry. So more aid is coming from the United States as well. But that was already it from me for now. Not too much for today. I hope you still enjoyed it despite the grim topic in general, and I guess limited good news for Ukraine. But as you know, I try to stick as much as I can to the actual facts and not turn this into a propaganda channel, despite clearly taking side for the Ukrainians. I see no reason to lie about this. So if you appreciate it, I would really really appreciate the thumbs up. And if you have anything to add, please use the comment section. Feel invited to do so. If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting this channel. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.